Right this minute, there's a sergeant in the 82nd Airborne Division sitting on a C-17 cargo jet on his way to Afghanistan. Let's call him Sergeant Reed. He's around 35 years old and he grew up in the northwestern part of the United States. He's been in the U.S. Army Infantry since he was 18 years old and he's already been deployed to Afghanistan twice before in the past. His battalion of 1,000 soldiers have been retasked from their original mission to go to Kuwait and diverted to the Kabul airport to help provide security for the chaotic final withdrawal that's unfolding there. This would allow the Pentagon to check a box, proof that they're providing security for the last remaining airport in the country that the US military still has any control over. Some of the younger guys in his platoon have never been deployed before and are nervous even if they'd never admit it. Truth be told, they prefer this mission to Kuwait, one last chance to do their job. Once they land, Sergeant Reed is temporarily shocked by the horrific scene in front of him. Thousands of civilians mob the airport. Afghani people are clinging to the sides of evacuation aircraft as they take off. The civilians are desperate to avoid their fate in Afghanistan under insurgent rule because they will face terrible reprisals for helping the Americans for the past 20 years. Sergeant Reed quickly snaps out of it and tasks 4 of his squads to create a 360-degree security perimeter. They keep their crew-served weapons evenly spaced out. He knows they can't hope to evacuate anyone without first establishing order and security. An Apache helicopter and some MRAPs help keep the massive crowds of people at bay, but the human wave closes in on the 82nd troops and the Marines they're with. Sergeant Reed uses his loudspeaker to tell the panicked crowd to remain calm and stay back, to wait their turn, but it's no use. He gives his soldiers permission to fire warning shots into the air to regain control. It is pure madness. It was weird to think that only a week prior, the whole country was a different story. The Western-backed government was still in charge, shops were open, and local security forces were walking the streets openly. Today, Kabul and Kandahar had fallen, and security forces hid from the insurgents. Of the 70,000 Afghans who applied to leave, only 1,000 had been saved so far. 15,000 American citizens were still trapped in the country. It was still unclear if the insurgents would grant them safe passage or not. From where Reed was standing, it didn't look like everyone was going to make it out of the country. Less than 5,000 meters away from his platoon's position at the airport, the insurgents had captured the presidential palace. Would the enemy decide to take advantage of their vulnerable situation at the airport? Sergeant Reed wouldn't think about that. He'd let the geniuses who got them into this mess in the first place figure it out. The US government claims they can get 5,000 civilians flown out and evacuated per day, but there are still tens of thousands of people who are eligible for this special immigrant visa. The government wants to check off the box that says that they've rescued many thousands of Afghani people. They're already taking pot shots at the airplanes as they take off. The enemy is now armed with all of the US military weapons and equipment stockpiles that they've captured from the surrendered outposts around the country. Over his radio, Sergeant Reed gets a report that his soldiers from 3rd Squad engaged 2 armed men and eliminated the threat. It's not immediately clear if these were insurgents or people hoping to just muscle their way onto the remaining planes out. The threat is eliminated for now, but the likelihood of more attacks are increasing by the minute. Sergeant Reed isn't surprised the enemy quickly captured the country in a matter of days instead of months. Heck, he could have saved the intelligence agencies a lot of time and money if they had cared to listen to him for even a second. But no one wanted to hear bad news like that at the top of the chain of command. For the past few years in Afghanistan, they wanted monthly reports that said all the boxes had been checked. Yes, sir. The Afghan National Army troops are in top shape. They'll hold off the T-band, no problem, sir. Roger that. Keep checking the boxes. Sergeant Reed, like many other veterans, had seen the red flags in his last deployment back in 2015. The local security forces were unmotivated, poorly trained, and barely supported by the Afghan government. There was an increase in insider attacks. Corruption was a way of life there, it seemed. The last time he came home from Afghanistan, most people didn't seem to care what he had done there at all. They especially didn't seem to care about the civilian population. Suddenly, it seemed like everyone had a tweet queued up, "Pray for the people of Afghanistan." Where were you for the past 20 years? He wondered to himself. Sergeant First Class Reed had read in an article that the US intelligence agencies thought the Afghan security forces would last 90 days. It's not that they didn't think a collapse would happen, they just thought the country wouldn't fall until mid-November, when everyone had already forgotten the war in Afghanistan and were too busy sipping on pumpkin spice lattes. Apparently everyone was saying this was one of the biggest military intelligence failures in American history. Some boxes had apparently been left unchecked. His first deployment all the way back in 2010 was as a know-nothing private, a young 21-year-old man. He looked back at those 14 months as some of the best and worst times in his life. 2010 was one of the most difficult years for the US military in Afghanistan, and his unit had helped recapture lost territory. They had helped retake Kandahar. It seemed like when he left, the country was back on track, and his second tour, years later, he actually had some responsibility. He was a squad leader. Still in his early 20s, he had more responsibility than all of his friends who were still going to college. His unit oversaw the construction of a school. They built 2 roads, and they even helped train an Afghan army company of soldiers. Truth be told, he was a little invested in their success at this point. He actually started to let himself think that maybe he had done some good there. Maybe he had accomplished something worthwhile in his life. He had checked the right boxes. His buddies, of course, were upset when they heard the news that Afghanistan's president, Ashraf Ghani, left the country and the Taliban had captured the majority of the country without firing a shot. Some veterans said that they were let down and embarrassed by the government handling of the situation. How could they allow this to happen? Some hours had passed and it was dark at the Kabul airport now. As they attempted to get some shut-eye, they could hear the crowds outside throughout the night, yelling, attempting to get onto the last planes. He'd arranged for his platoon to sleep in one of the airport's administrative buildings, one that still had hardened overhead concrete cover. Second platoon had the night shift, keeping the tarmac under control while they slept. Evacuations would continue 24 hours a day until they got the order that they wouldn't. Sergeant First Class Reed caught part of a news broadcast on a TV that was left abandoned in the rec room. Politicians and military officials back home were on there trying to convince him that the 2 years he'd spent deployed in Afghanistan during the best part of his life wasn't all for nothing. It wasn't in vain after all. They pointed to the fact that there hadn't been another major attack on US soil since the invasion of Afghanistan. Insurgent organizations had been weakened enough that the threat of another 9/11 happening was non-existent thanks to his work. They said he helped give women in Afghanistan the opportunity to go to school and participate in the world for the first time for the past 20 years. They said he'd done everything he could to train the security forces there, but you could only lead a horse to water. Sergeant Reed didn't know if he bought any of that. He thought he'd figure it out once he got back home, once he had all of his guys home safely, finally, and for the last time. Put a question mark in that box. Tomorrow, his platoon, the 82nd Airborne, and the Marines that made up the 5,000 remaining soldiers in Afghanistan would continue to do their job just like they'd done for the past 20 years. They would provide security and continue to help as many Afghan citizens escape the country as possible. Whether it was in vain or not, they had done what was asked of them. They had served their country honorably and with purpose. Sergeant Reed thought that would always be one box worth checking no matter what. So Sergeant Reed isn't exactly a real person. He's based on various real people. He represents the experience of many of my friends who served in Afghanistan. He represents many of the servicemen, women, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who fought honorably over the past 20 years in Operation Enduring Freedom. To all of the veterans of the Afghanistan War, this video is my small bit of appreciation.